Hello, my friends. Welcome to a video on the 6.13 essay. I'm here to help you get through it, and unlike this bear, not to think that the 6.13 essay is out to get you, so don't be like our bear friend here. We're not like bears anyway, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about what you can do to write your 6.13 essay and maybe how we can break it down a bit. So the first thing to consider is what is the argument of your question. And when you think about this, we're currently fighting a war on terror, and we might think that that's kind of like the Cold War, or maybe we don't. And that's kind of where the point of your essay comes from, is comparing and contrasting the Cold War and the war on terror. So you're comparing and contrasting the Cold War and the war on terror and deciding how they're similar and how they are different. So that's what we want to be looking at here. And if you'll excuse me, you do have an essay. It is technically due on Tuesday, April 12th, but if you can work on getting it done by Friday, which is the 15th, that would be fabulous. And let's look at the essay itself. So I've got to move myself, pardon me, while I go shooting over here to the side. You are going to compare and contrast the Cold War with the War on Terror, and you've been given 4 different items to explain what they mean as well as how they're significant to each war. So how is communism, Iron Curtain, Cuban Missile Crisis, and Vietnam War significant to the Cold War? And how are these 4 items significant to the War on Terror? So it's important not just to say what is communism, but how did communism contribute to the Cold War? And it's important to remember also that we've given you some wonderful resources here, some papers, some videos, some essays that really address that question of how are the Cold War and the War on Terror similar, how are they different, and they talk about the handling of the two. So I highly encourage you to pay attention to that and look. And I'm going to move myself over here because voila! There are 4 parts you want to consider when you're writing your essay, and you could have 4 different paragraphs. You might have more, you might have less. I wouldn't go much less though. So you want to think about the 4 events listed here for the Cold War. Tell me a little bit about each and why it's significant to the Cold War. What does it contribute to the Cold War? Is it the cause? Is it something that has to do with the war continuing? And we'll talk more about that. Also, for the second part, you want to explain each of the 4 events listed under the War of Terror and why they are significant. So we'll get to that. Then you want to compare and contrast the Cold War with the War on Terrorism. And when you compare, you show how it is similar to the War on Terror. When you contrast, you show what's different about the Cold War and the War on Terror. And the 4th part is your opinion. Using the scientific evidence, or excuse me, the historical evidence, sorry, to decide which one is better. And where I got scientific from is I always think of this like a science paper. You know, I have to do an experiment and then build up evidence to see if it supports my hypothesis. In a historical paper, though, you want to support your hypothesis. You're not disproving it. So instead, you're using that historical evidence to show how you are correct. So let's start a little bit with the Cold War, and I have a fun little meme up here. This kid thought it was called the Cold War because it was always freezing in Russia. I thought that was kind of funny. I actually had a friend who thought that too. So let's start with communism. Sorry, let me move myself over here. Communism is a belief that the people should own the means of production of goods. So like the factories, they should own the ways that goods are produced. And that there should be an end to social classes because instead of some people having everything and a few people having nothing, everyone has what they need. So that's the concept behind communism. Why is it significant? Well, it really is kind of what leads to a division that starts the Cold War. How about the Iron Curtain? Remember, this is not a real curtain. There's no actual curtain laying over Europe. This was that imaginary dividing line that Winston Churchill referred to, and it kind of looked like a curtain because it was the edges of where the communist countries and the non-communist countries touched, and it kind of divides it into 2 sides. So you've got your communist side and your non-communist side, and that's really what kind of sets up this idea of us versus them. So when you think about what's significant, you could talk about how it does kind of set up the 2 sides. The Cuban Missile Crisis, remember Cuba becomes communist and they go to the Soviet Union, they ask for help. The Soviet Union gives Cuba missiles, which makes the United States a little nervous because now all of a sudden there's missiles within striking distance. So they decide to send a force of Cuban exiles to go down and take over those missiles and stop it. Except when they get there, oops, Cuba actually knew we were coming, was able to repel the attack. And it causes a lot of blowback against the United States because now they kind of look foolish. So they have to respond. And so you can think about the significance of how this really kind of brought the war to the head, but you can also think of the significance of the response of other countries, as well as how the United States and Soviet Union responded. And the last one is Vietnam. Vietnam, as you remember, was divided into two parts. You have North Vietnam, which is communist, South Vietnam, which is democratic capitalist society. North Vietnam wants to invade. They want to unite Vietnam into one part under communism. The South asks for help from countries like the United States that are not communist. The United States and other countries come in and they attack South Vietnam. So you need to think about the domino theory. If you're talking about the significance here, in Vietnam we were very concerned about one country falling, every country would fall. How about that war on terror? And once again, I have a fun little meme for you. It makes me think of a Tide commercial. It's our new war that removes terrorists fast. When you think about some of the events of the war on terror, one group you have to think about is the Taliban. This group who harbored Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. This is a government that was very conservative and it was considered very repressive. It oppressed its people, especially women. Something you can compare, for example, in communism, there really was only one way of doing things, one way of thinking. Taliban was very similar. Both really believed in kind of one way and they didn't allow for opposition. So that might be a way that you think of them as similar. September 11th, of course, this is the attack by Al-Qaeda on United States soil, where you have the two World Trade Towers being knocked down. Then, of course, the Pentagon was attacked. There was a third plane, remember, but it was stopped by the passengers on board, and they crashed it into a field in Pennsylvania. So this is one of the biggest attacks on U.S. soil in recent history, and it really sets up this sort of us versus them. So again, when you think a little bit about the Iron Curtain and how it divides the Cold War into sides, 9/11 kind of divides the United States against the terrorists, so it kind of divides them into sides. Of course, there's also some differences, and I'll get to that. But let's talk about the war in Afghanistan. This is retribution. The Taliban attacked the United States on 9/11, so the United States attacks Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and tries to free Afghanistan from the Taliban's oppressive regime, and then either kill or capture Osama bin Laden, who was Al-Qaeda's leader. You also have your war in Iraq, which was started in 2003 after fears that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, the WMDs. These were chemical or biological weapons. The United States and the UN actually went to Saddam Hussein and said, look, after the first Gulf War, you agreed that we could come in at any time and inspect your weapon production and your missiles, so you need to let us see these. Saddam Hussein refused, and the United States ultimately went to war. They did not do so with the UN's blessing. And in fact, a lot of countries were very unhappy about the United States jumping into this war. It seemed like it was over really fast, like woohoo, you know, they just ran in and 6 weeks later they were done. But after a while, the Iraqis regrouped, they began to fight back, and so this war has continued on for many years. A lot of people do compare Vietnam to Iraq. They say that there's not really any justification for the United States to be there. Of course, other people say that the United States needed to be in Vietnam and Iraq to ensure freedom. And so while they weren't attacked by them, if they didn't go in, there eventually would be an attack. So you can look at it either way. And of course, the war in Afghanistan is seen as a more justified war because they attacked us first. So again, that might be a way that you compare or that you use as a difference. So, comparing and contrasting. When we compare these two items, I'm going to put myself up in the corner, we look at what is similar, and I just want to pull myself over to see that word similar about the Cold War and the war on terrorism. You can think about the wars of Vietnam and Iraq, the fact that we didn't really have an exit strategy, that we tried to train the people before leaving, but maybe it was not particularly successful. The fact that the war seemed to drag on, guerrilla warfare was a part of it. Are there competing ideologies driving both wars? Of course, you have communism versus the United States, and in the War on Terror, you have the United States versus conservative Islam or fundamental Islam. So you could point out that in both sides, it was the United States versus a different ideology. Of course, you can also contrast that, the fact that it was different ideologies. One was a government and one was a religion. Are there events that brought each war to a head? The Cuban Missile Crisis and 9/11, for example, both kind of brought this crisis to its boiling point. You could contrast. You'll need to talk about what's different between the two wars. Is there a rationale for fighting? Maybe you say the war in Afghanistan is justified, but the war on Vietnam was not. So you might talk about these two and maybe which one was more justified, how they're different. You could also point out that there may not have been clearly drawn sides. One war, maybe we knew exactly who we're fighting, and the other war, it's kind of nebulous. We're not 100% sure who we're fighting. And then also, what about the style of fighting? You know, in the Cold War, it was all really war through proxies and war of words versus the war on terrorism, which is much more direct, much more fighting. Remember those websites and articles I circled? Those could be very useful for answering this question. That's where you want to go look at those. You'll get a lot of good ideas out of there. So the last part that you need to do is to tell me what you think. Did we learn a lot from the Cold War so we can handle that war on terrorism better? Do you think we're making the same mistakes? It's up to you. Do you think we handled the Cold War better than the war on terror? It really doesn't matter what position you take. You can give any opinion you want to as long as you can use your historical evidence to back it up. And with that in mind, I want you to read 2 paragraphs and tell me which one used historical evidence better to back up their point, so you don't need to worry about circling. Here's the first one. I think we're doing worse because Vietnam is like the war on Iraq. We need to stop the war on terrorism because people are dying. Okay, second one. I think we are handling the war on terrorism much better than we handled the Cold War. In Vietnam, we didn't really stop the threat. We just rebuilt their government and asked the leader to stop. In the war in Iraq, we removed the leader before we began to rebuild their government. So what do you think? Which one uses more historical evidence? Hopefully you notice here that this person talked about how in Vietnam we didn't really stop the government, just tried to rebuild their government and asked the leader to stop, versus the war in Iraq where we removed the leader before we began to rebuild the government. So that's an actual attempt at using historical evidence to compare the two. This one, there's nothing wrong with the opinion. Let me get my arrow back, pardon me. There's nothing wrong with this opinion over here. It's just that there's no historical evidence, and that's really the key. If you can't use historical evidence to prove it, then your opinion really isn't going to be accepted. And I found a funny meme that I thought I'd offer you here. Iraq is like the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I or II, and the Cold War, and Korea, and Vietnam, and the epic struggle against the freedom-hating Klingons. And he says, if we don't fight the Romulans in the neutral zone, we'll have to fight them here. So this was a jab at George W. Bush. Do you think that that's correct, or do you think we were more, of course, this one's saying we're not really supposed to be in Iraq. Other people might argue we are. So that's something you could think about. Okay, last thing I want to show you is the rubric. Let me see if I can put myself up in the corner. Here I am. When I look at the rubric, I'm going to be real honest with you. The first thing I do is I look straight down the highest number. So in this case, it's 4. I want to make sure I have a thorough explanation of each item in the Cold War and explain the significance. I want a thorough explanation of all 4 of the items in the War on Terror and their significance. Then I want to compare and contrast, not one or the other, both. I then want to talk about my view on the handling of the WOT, stands for War on Terror. I was typing quickly. And give 2 or 3 reasons why I've decided that I think it's handled better, it's handled worse. What do you think? And then of course look at this, guys, the mechanics. Sometimes I get essays and it's like, did they even try to put in capital letters? Did they even try to put in punctuation? I know that we all have different strengths, and what I look for is that you tried. Sometimes I get them and I can barely read them because they're just this one giant run-on sentence. So do your best with the grammar. Have someone proofread it for you if at all possible. Okay, I hope you're saying to yourself, I might be able to tackle this. I know you can do this. It will help you prepare for the end of course test, so see, you're killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Score! If you have any questions, please contact your teacher for assistance, whether it's my students or anyone else. And here's a little fun meme. Keep calm and write your essay. And remember, your teachers are here for you if you need them. So take care, my friends.